Hi everyone, I'm Paolo Santiago of the Atteneo Human Rights Center, and for this second part of the video, I'll be discussing the development of human rights in law, as well as a brief overview of the system of protection of human rights. Let me begin. After World War I, the international community came together and established the League of Nations. But we do know that the League of Nations failed because we also had World War II. So after World War II, again, the international community came together and established what we now know as the United Nations, or the UN. What differentiates the UN from the League of Nations is that in the Charter of the UN, human rights was mentioned as the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. But the international community was also discussing, what do we mean by human rights? So in 1945, when the UN was established, it took 3 years for the UN to come up with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The UDHR encompasses all human rights: civil, political, economic, social, cultural rights. But it was also the time when we had what we call the Cold War, or the conflict between the East versus the West. The West being the freedom-loving countries, while the East are the socialist and communist bloc countries. And this is when the politicization of human rights also came in. For the freedom-loving countries, they think that civil and political rights are more important. For the East, or the socialist and communist countries, they think that economic, social, and cultural rights are more important. And since the UDHR is a declaration which, under the international law, is non-binding, there is a need to make it binding through conventions. And this is the reason why the international community actually split the UDHR into two. You have the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights on one hand, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights on the other. Taken all together, the UDHR, the ICCPR, and the ICSCR, these are what is known as the International Bill of Human Rights. Aside from these two conventions, we also have 7 thematic international human rights conventions. First is the Convention on the Elimination of all forms of racial discrimination, which defines racial discrimination as any distinction, exclusion, restriction, or preference based on race, color, descent, or national or ethnic origin, which has the purpose or effect of nullifying or impairing the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise on an equal footing of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, and social, cultural, or any other field of public life. Second, we also have the Convention on the Rights of the Child. The CRC is actually the most ratified international human rights treaty in the world. There's only one UN member state which is not a state party to this convention. And this convention encompasses the civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights of children, giving emphasis on the right to development, right to participation, right to protection, and also the best interest of children. Third, we have the Convention on the Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. The term discrimination against women means any distinction, exclusion, or restriction made on the basis of sex, which has the effect or purpose of impairing or nullifying the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise by women, irrespective of their marital status, on a basis of equality of men and women, of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, social, cultural, civil, or any other field. Fourth, we have the Convention Against Torture, and other inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. Torture is defined as any act by which severe pain or suffering, whether physical or mental, is intentionally inflicted on a person for such purposes as obtaining from him or a third person information or a confession, punishing him for an act that he or a third person has committed or is suspected of having committed, or intimidating or coercing him or a third person, or for any reason based on discrimination of any kind, when such pain or suffering is inflicted by or at the instigation of or with the consent or acquiescence of a public official or other person acting in an official capacity. But it does not include the pain or suffering arising from or inherent in any or incidental to any lawful sanctions. Actions which are short of the definition of this torture may still constitute cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. Fifth, we have the Migrant Workers Convention, or the International Convention on the Protection of All Migrant Workers and Their Families. In this convention, it talks about migration as an issue and what are the human rights involved for migrant workers as well as their families. Sixth, we have the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. This convention promotes and protects, ensures the full and equal enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms by all persons with disabilities, to promote, respect their inherent dignity. And the last convention is the International Convention on the Protection of All Persons Against Enforced Disappearances. And enforced disappearance is defined as the arrest, detention, abduction, or any other form of deprivation of liberty by agents of the state or by persons or a group of persons acting with the authorization, support, or acquiescence of the state, followed by the refusal to acknowledge the deprivation of liberty or by the concealment of the fate or whereabouts of the disappeared person, which places such person outside the protection of law. So, these are the International Convention on Human Rights, and these form the international standards to which we define human rights. Now, the state, as part of the international community and as parties to these conventions, as an entity which has commitment to human rights, has also a threefold obligation. First is the obligation to respect. States have the obligation to refrain from interfering with the enjoyment of rights. In short, obligation to respect simply means that we do not expect the state itself to violate the rights of the people. Second is the obligation to protect. States have the obligation to prevent violations of rights by other persons or by third parties. It simply means that the obligation to protect by the state needs remedial measures being done by the state, so that if a right or if rights of certain persons have been violated, they have a remedy to seek that is provided for by the state. And the third is the obligation to fulfill. States have the obligation to take appropriate measures towards the realization of rights. Simply put, if there is a vacuum, then the obligation to fulfill simply means that the state must come up with policies or legislation in order to promote and protect those rights. The last point is how are rights protected, or the systems of protection. And we have three systems of protection. We have the international, the regional, and the domestic system. When we talk of the international system, we have the UN system in mind. And when we talk of the UN system, it could be what you call based on the UN Charter, which are charter-based mechanisms. We have, for example, a mechanism called the UN Human Rights Council, which mandates the universal periodic review of human rights compliance of all member states of the UN. We also have the treaty-based mechanisms. So, all 9 international human rights treaties that I mentioned earlier have its own treaty-based mechanism, which is in the form of a committee. So, all state parties to these conventions have the duty to periodically report its compliance to these treaties. And some of these treaties also have what we call communication procedures, which in effect is a complaint procedure for violation of rights that they cover. So this is, in essence, the international protection of human rights. We also have regional protection of human rights. And when we talk about region, we talk about continental regions of the world. Particularly, we have the European system, where you have the European Court of Human Rights. In the Inter-Americas, we have the Inter-American Commission and Court of Human Rights. And in Africa, we have the African Commission and African Court of Human Rights. So violations of human rights, as long as it satisfies the exhaustion of domestic remedies, could be remedied through these mechanisms. Here in the Philippines, we are part of the Asia-Pacific. There is no particular regional mechanism yet for the whole Asia-Pacific. In fact, there's none for Asia. But what we have is a new mechanism, a fledgling mechanism in Southeast Asia, particularly in ASEAN, or Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And we have 2 mechanisms so far. We have the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights and the ASEAN Commission on the Promotion and Protection of the Rights of Women and Children. So, human rights compliance within the region can be lodged within these mechanisms. And the third enforcement mechanism or system of protection is what we call the domestic system. The domestic system is our country system, and this is actually the best way to promote and protect human rights. And in the Philippines, for example, which agencies actually promote and protect human rights? The answer actually is all 3 branches of government. You might have thought it is the Commission on Human Rights, but the Commission on Human Rights is actually a watchdog to find out whether our government is actually complying with its obligation on human rights. But it essentially legislative, because it is the legislature which comes up with law, and we have a number of human rights legislations. Executive, because it is the executive department which actually enforces the law to make sure that we are all protected. And we have the judiciary, which provides remedial measures if there are violations of human rights. So this, in essence, concludes my brief discussion on the codification of human rights, as well as an overview of the systems of protection of human rights. Thank you very much.